We welcome back former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, out with a new book titled Vengeance. We'll talk about that in just a moment, and your wife's book and her new posting. But let's talk about former President George W. Bush. His speech in New York this past week, he said politics seems to be more vulnerable to conspiracy theories or outright fabrication. He also took aim at the president without mentioning him specifically. Your reaction?
Well, I think there's some very real differences between both President Bush and Senator McCain, who also had a tough speech this week, and President Trump. And I think part of what the Republican primary fight was about in 2015 and 16 was which of those two worldviews did Republican voters want. And by a pretty decisive margin, they said they thought the past had not worked, was not to their advantage, and they wanted change. And, but I can appreciate, Trump was not recruited by the establishment. He won a hostile takeover. Well, I can appreciate that the losing side of the takeover is not happy.
We've been talking about this New York Times editorial about globalism versus America first. Where would you put the president's foreign policy? How would you frame his doctrine?
Look, I think that there's a tendency on the part of the people who want to defend globalism to not be honest about what it is. Globalism, in its essence, if you look at the John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama version, is the subordination of the United States to a series of international agreements, often dominated by countries that are not democracies. If you said to me, do I think we should be in the General Assembly of the United Nations? Sure. Do I think we should take it very seriously? No. I mean, look at the countries who vote in the General Assembly. Look at who's on the Human Rights Commission, all the dictators. So I think there's some reason to believe that they conflate being involved in the international order, which Trump is for, with globalism, which is the domination of the United States by a series of multinational agreements where we give away our sovereignty to countries, many of which do not share our values, many of which are themselves dictatorships. I don't think the current Venezuela government is the moral equivalent of the United States government.
Well, you're a student of history. Is this a dramatic shift from post-World War II engagement that we've seen by the U.S.?
I don't think it's a dramatic shift from engagement, but it's a dramatic shift from the solution. The solution after World War II, our elites thought, was to create an international order, what George H.W. Bush called the New World Order. Well, there is no New World Order. You have the Chinese who are trying to become, at a minimum, our competitor and at a maximum dominate us. You have chaos in a whole number of countries. You have Islamic radicals who range from Niger, where they ambushed Americans, to the Philippines, where they occupied an entire city, to ISIS in Raqqa in Syria. I mean, this is not a world order. And so the question becomes, what's the best baseline in which to defend American values and American interests? I think it's useful and healthy, and I think Trump's speech at the United Nations, his speech in Warsaw, these are very serious speeches outlining a sovereignty-based international commitment as opposed to a globalist lawyer diplomatic base, which is, I think, a failed model.
And this is a debate that your party faced in the 1950s. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, Dwight Eisenhower became the nominee and the leader of your party for 8 years. Is it, obviously, the circumstances have changed somewhat, but is it similar to the debate that we saw in the 1950s?
No, I don't think so for this reason. I think Taft really did want to avoid engaging the Soviet Union. I mean, he really wanted to revert to a pre-World War II kind of isolationism. Trump's not an isolationist. I mean, Trump thoroughly understands there's a larger world. We have hardly disengaged. We are more engaged in Korea. We are more engaged in Syria. The whole range of places. He's trying to get the Congress to agree to rebuild the military. I mean, these are not the acts of isolationism, but he wants to base his international activities on American sovereignty and American interests. Well, I'm not sure I understand why people think having an American president believe that their job is to protect American jobs and to worry about American interests. Why is that a big shock? I mean, I understand why it is to the New York Times, but they live in a fantasy world that's crazy.
One of the debates inside the White House, should the president travel to the DMZ in South Korea along the border? Should he?
I would leave that entirely up to the South Korean government and the American commander in Korea. To be honest, I have no idea.
Is NATO still working the way it was intended?
Well, no, it can't be because there's no Soviet Union. I mean, NATO was intended to contain and stop the Soviet Union, particularly from taking over Germany. Well, it worked. I mean, it's one of the most successful alliances in history. And then one morning, the Soviet Union disappeared, and all these people at NATO headquarters were faced with a crisis. What do we do now? And they have held the alliance together now for 20 years, 26 years, since the Soviets disappeared. NATO overall is useful, but I'll give you an example, and this is why I'm a PhD in European history, and I've lived in Europe a number of times, and I'm about to go back to Europe. When the Chancellor of Germany, who's a very smart woman, a very smart leader, when she says, well, it's time for the Europeans to lead. And I got hit with this when I was in Kiev the other day. And I said to him, the morning she increases her defense spending, I'll take it seriously. But the Germans don't have a military strong enough to lead anywhere. They'd be lucky to get to the German border. So, the Europeans got to decide who they want to be. They have lived on American security and on American strength since 1945. We're saying to them, George W. Bush said to them, and Don Rumsfeld said to them, you ought to do more. You're not doing your fair share. Well, Germany's one of the largest economies on the planet. They ought to at least be able to defend themselves, even if they can't defend the rest of Europe. And then I'm happy for us to be there to reinforce everybody, but there's a big willingness to let the U.S. carry the burden, and I think that's wrong.
And the person who leads these negotiations, the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, is he doing so from a position of strength or weakness?
I think he's probably doing so a little bit from a position of confusion. I think Tillerson's a very smart man, and I think he ran ExxonMobil, which is a giant corporation with great capabilities. But it's really different. But ultimately, the Secretary of State is a staff job, and the person you're staffed to is the President of the United States. You're not the head of the corporation anymore. And so I think he has a very different job. My sense is that overall, the agreement between Secretary Tillerson, Secretary of Defense Mattis, the National Security Advisor McMaster, the Chief of Staff John Kelly, is very, very high. And I think that they try to present the President with serious options, most of which I think he engages in pretty effectively. I think their track record so far has been that after all the noise and all the arguments, that they are broadly achieving the strategies that they believe in.
Our conversation with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, when was the first time you were on this network? Do you remember?
Well, I was trying to remember. You guys went on
March of 1979.
I think you were a child at the time. I came here.
I wasn't even born.
Yeah, is that true?
No, I'm kidding.
I was going to say I'm going to feel really old at this point. No, I ran twice, and lost, 74 and 76. I won in 78. I was sworn in January of 79. You guys showed up. I thought it was April, but you guys showed up in March. You'd have to check the archives out at Purdue, but my guess is I was on C-SPAN by June or July.
And I think you have among the most appearances on this network. So let's remind our audience, we'll get to your phone calls in just a moment, out with a new book, Who Knew? A fiction thriller. Yeah. Vengeance. What's this all about?
Well, Vengeance is about the world we live in. It's about the terrorists getting 2 supertankers of oil, swapping them with the North Koreans for nuclear material, not weapons, but material, to make dirty bombs, and the joint effort of the United States and Saudi Arabia and Israel to try to find the terrorists before they can set off the bombs that would just make whole sections of a city uninhabitable. I think it's a very dynamic story. I think it's also very real in the sense that I think it helps shape national defense thinking in 2 ways. One, you have to have an all capabilities analysis of your enemy. You can't just say about the North Koreans, well, they're going to build missiles. Yeah, they might build missiles. What else can they do? And this is an example. Second, you can't think about a binary world of the U.S., North Korea, the U.S., Iran, etc. You have to think about a networked world in which, for example, the North Koreans sell the Iranians missiles. The North Koreans at one point were trying to build a nuclear facility in Syria. And so you have to ask yourself, what's the enemy network doing, not just what is one single country doing?
So how much of it is fiction and how much of it is nonfiction in the book?
Well, the action is all fiction, but the underlying principles are totally nonfiction. And I think anybody who reads Vengeance will have a much deeper appreciation of how dangerous the world is and how much we have to be prepared to stop bad people from doing horrifying things.
And your wife's book, Remember the Ladies.
This is Callista's 7th volume, in which Ellis the elephant teaches 4 to 8-year-olds about American history. Remember the Ladies is the president's wives, from a letter by Abigail Adams to John Adams. As he's writing the Declaration of Independence, he writes and says, remember the ladies when you're doing all these things, which they don't, not for another 100 years. But it's a great book. Ellis is a terrific character, and the little kids really like the books. Susan Arciero does the drawings, and they're just they leap off the page. They're beautiful. And Calista, of course, is sort of frustrated because now that she has been nominated and confirmed to be the ambassador of the Vatican, she's not allowed to go on TV and talk about it. She cannot do anything about her own book because she's now a government employee.
Well, you just did, though.
I did. I'm trying to carry the family books.
And we'll talk about Calista Gingrich. Real quick question, because we sat down with Hillary Clinton last week in Chappaqua, New York, and in her book, she quotes John Adams' letter to his wife, "May only good and honest men live under this roof," referring to the White House. And out of all the U.S. presidents, she said that she would not put Donald Trump in that category.
Well, of course she wouldn't. He beat her. I mean, there's a certain human condition here.
But she did say if she had lost to McCain or Romney, she would have been okay with it.
Yeah, but I think Trump is a much bigger break with the old order. And that's what people have not come to grips with yet. Donald Trump was a decision by the American people, first in the primaries and then in the general election, that they wanted a dramatically different direction. And they're getting it. I mean, they're getting it in judges, they're getting it in deregulation, they're getting it in policy recommendations. But it's a little bit like Reagan would have been seen the same way in 1981. We have a romantic view backwards of Reagan, but Reagan in 1981 was a very disruptive figure and an enormous shock both to the Republican and the Democratic establishments.